Okay, so this wasn't too bad, right?
It was all right.
I mean, it's not a lot, but I mean, it's like, he's attacking the left a little bit, right? You must like that.
Yeah. I don't know, man. It leaves me kind of cold. I got to the end and it was like, where's the workers of the world unite? Marx did it better.
Well, he'd probably admit that too. Yeah. So yeah, we're finishing up with chapter 5 and 6, Ben Burgis's give them an argument, logic for the left. And basically about chapter 5 is about hasty generalizations.
Right.
And then, I mean, chapter 6 was, I feel like more he was just kind of saying his issue. I mean, both of them, he was kind of saying what his issues with the left are. But yeah, chapter 6 focusing on things to correct in the left, you know, basically.
Yeah. I think we did it. Good podcast,
guys. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting though. So I guess starting with the hasty generalizations, which is just that, people generalizing too quickly with their data. And so he's really kind of laying into Nate Silver, which I thought was kind of interesting. Yeah. And
I didn't know who Nate Silver was.
Oh, no? You don't remember 538? I mean, they talked about it a lot during the 2016 election, but I guess you probably weren't an NPR listener, were you?
No.
Yeah, no, I listened.
I haven't listened to NPR since I was like 18.
Yeah, no, I mean, probably the 2016 election was the last time I was really listening to them, and then slowly.
I remember that little jingle. Do dip dip dip.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, they were talking. I mean, yeah. I mean, I was young. What do you expect? No. But yeah, I mean, 538 was just a polling. I mean, they were like one of the big pollsters of the time.
I see.
And yeah, I mean, I think makes a lot of good points about how they were almost getting so caught up in clicks that it ended up just being they would put out like unedited transcripts, and they ended up kept saying like the same talking points, like Hillary Clinton and what's his face Bernie voted the same way 93% of the time, and his big point was, well, that's a hasty generalization to assume that they're the same because of that, because you have to look at what were the things that they voted differently on, and it was like voting differently on the war in Iraq, the Patriot Act, and all that stuff.
There's also an even broader take, I think, on that, where not every issue is going to be brought up for vote in Congress. And they happen to be sort of both generally on the blue side, and so there's going to be a lot of binary issues that they might end up voting the same way on, that they still even have important differences, but it's outside of the parameters of that particular vote.
Right, and exactly. And I think the broader point about that chapter that I do very much agree with is the fact that it really all comes down to just bad statistical training, I would say, because that's where the hasty generalization comes from. And he's bringing up another person who's, I can't remember the exact example, but it was just like basically looking at comments that politicians made to try to then rank them as a certain way of like progressive or something.
Oh, the PolitiFact thing?
Yeah, the PolitiFact. Yeah. And his point, which is a very good point and is known to anybody that's sort of done statistical analysis, is that you have to do some sort of randomization to this, or else it's, for all you know, what you're picking is already a biased source, right? And even when you completely try to randomize it, it's not a perfect system, but there's a lot of just little points that you would learn in a basic statistical class that, makes it easy to manipulate numbers, and makes it easy for people to be manipulated by them.
Right.
Yeah, so I thought that was all a very good point, and is, I think, a big issue in our society is just people are generally have an aversion to math, and I think a lot of it's how it's taught, and I mean, yeah. I don't know what. What are you laughing at? Let me get off my pedestal.
I think it's a Louis C.K. joke.
Yeah.
Where he's just joking about what a math teacher is.
Oh, yeah.
And they're like, oh, so your job is to teach little kids math. Oh, great. Do they want to learn math? No, they do not.
No, they don't.
They really don't want to.
No, they don't. No, it's true. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, but I guess what I mean by that is that there are ways to teach why you're teaching certain things. That was a big thing I felt like was always missed when we were learning things. I mean, and granted, maybe I just didn't have the
I mean, the problem
capacity.
is when you're teaching arithmetic, the reason why to learn it is like having good number sense is generally very helpful in your life. But why would a 7-year-old care about that at all?
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, and this is where we can get into a whole thing about how just teaching basics of anything is difficult to teaching kids. You know this as a guitar teacher. I mean, it's like you have to teach them technique or else they're going to like get carpal tunnel and stuff, but it's hard to but it's hard to get that across to somebody that's very young.
Right.
Which is why you almost have to be dictatorial at that stage. Right. Because you know that it's for the betterment of them.
Right.
Yeah. But
So point that I have on it because he kept talking about Nate Silver being like quote data driven and stuff like that, being kind of snarky. And I actually think that there's a broader issue, and this is sort of outside the scope of Ben Burgis' argument in this book. But I think that data driven, we've talked a little bit about it, but I think put my finger on what my issue with it is.
Evidence-based?
While I was reading it. Same thing. Evidence-based, data-driven. They're terms that are used to grant credibility or authority to a practice. But to me, both of those phrases suggest that you should actually not listen to that person.
Yeah, it's becoming that way, yeah.
Right. Because I don't think anybody should be data-driven because data doesn't drive. Data doesn't tell you anything. And we talked about it, was it the doctor's book?
It was a long time ago, yeah.
With Semmelweis? No, the washing hands guy.
Yeah, Semmelweis.
Semmelweis. Yeah. When they were talking about, creating all sorts of crazy experiments, and then you have the data. But then how do you interpret that data? And different people interpret that data differently. So the driving is the interpretation. That is people's own faculties of reasoning that should be driving it. Data shouldn't be driving anything because data has nothing in it. Data doesn't. Data doesn't have interpretive content.
Right, I see what you're getting at. And broadly, I agree because it has been exactly used, as you said, as a credibility marker and also almost like a way to be like, so you don't need to think too deeply about this because I've already thought deeply about it.
Right. And I think Ben Burgis, he makes a point that I think is spot on with respect to this data-driven because he suggests that terms like that are used to suggest that it's not ideologically driven or it's not biased or something like that, when in fact your interpretation of your data will be based on your ideologies. Yes.
But I mean, yes and no. I guess anything can be looked at as an ideology. I guess you're getting at like the filter that you interpret reality. But I guess this is getting back to my point about statistics, is that there are certain, I guess you could say, axioms, almost.
Oh yeah, back to Hoppe.
Yeah.
That's what he said.
Yeah, well, and just general. I mean, he got it from the mathematicians, right?
Right.
And that there are things that we just know that you need to do if you're going to do a proper statistical analysis. And so even if somebody says it's data-driven, there's so many examples in the scientific literature of people not statistically analyzing their things correctly. Like maybe they use an unpaired or a paired t-test when they should have used an unpaired t-test and stuff like that. Like their samples weren't independent. I mean, or their sample distribution wasn't normal. I mean, so much of our statistical analysis assumes a Gaussian or normal distribution of the data, meaning that it's a specific mean and standard deviation is a defined region, and many things are not that way. Although I guess the law of large numbers says everything goes to that. But yeah, I mean, so, and there are ways to analyze things if it's not normal, but you just need to know that, and you need to actually look at your distribution and things like that. And then we can get into a question of like statistical significance is just a very sort of interpretable thing as well, because there's certain thresholds that people will choose, like 95% confidence versus 99% confidence. Is your p-value 0.05 or is it 0.001? Or, it's like, yeah, I don't know. So, and then, and anyway, I could go on, but that's basically the point, is that I think a lot of the times when people are saying these things, and if you don't have knowledge about how to look at these, then you can become manipulated by people like that.
Even if you have knowledge, because the other thing is embedded in what you're saying. It's not that I don't think it's useful. I think it is useful, but embedded in what you're saying is that these types of I guess correlational algorithms or something like that provide useful information. And as an axiom or something like that, that it doesn't not make sense, but it is. You are coming into it by this is so we have data, and here's ways that we can use that data to come up with useful information.
Yes, and it's also worth noting that statistical significance is really, in its formal sense, like about 100 years old. So, because it was, it's called the student t-test because a guy that worked for Guinness in Ireland was the one that sort of published it, but he published it anonymously, I think under the name Student. And he came up with it. Yeah, he came up with it, though, as a method to sort of help optimize basically like the brewing. It had something to do with the batch,
Nice. Cool.
And but the point is it's not that old. And it actually, in terms of just using probability in the West, is probably, I think the first time it was the ratiometric quotient or something like that is what they called it when you first sort of started looking at just probability, was just in I think the 1600s. So obviously you can infer things. I mean, we have been inferring things before that time, and we were understanding the idea of significance, even though it wasn't codified in statistics before 100 years ago. I'm just bringing all these up to say that it's just, we should all be skeptical when people say things, and as you said, have a defiant way of being like, this is data driven, and we should always look into things. And so, I thought it was very good that he was laying into Nate Silver, because that was a big issue with the 2016 election, as you probably remember, even if you didn't know 538, but I mean, all the pollsters got it wrong, right? That was the big thing. Everybody thought that Hillary was going to win, and then everybody was very surprised. Not everybody, but all the people in the ivory towers that were talking about data-driven sort of stuff.
Right.
But the reality was that they were looking at, it must be that their data that they were polling was biased in some way, or else how could they have gotten it so wrong? They must have been polling just the wrong, not a very good random population, or of course people weren't being honest. That's probably another thing. I don't know.
Right.
It's a crazy. I mean, anyway. It's a little bit of an aside, but it's just crazy, man. That I feel like things really just started becoming wild after 2015.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, they were obviously 2008 was a wild year. Also, maybe 2008, maybe 2001.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I didn't, I think the first thing I didn't like about the chapter, and maybe what turned me off to it, was there's a section where he gives a little quote from Nate Silver, where Nate Silver is sort of trying to disclose his biases or something like that, where he says, first, my economic priors and preferences are closer to the economists than Piketty's. Second, I haven't finished Piketty's book, although I spent some time explaining the data. And third, I'm no expert on macroeconomic policy or macroeconomic data. To me, it sounds fine. I don't know. It's maybe you should have finished the book, but to me, it doesn't matter. Like, he's telling you ahead of time what the issues with what he's going to be saying are. That all seems fair. And then he gives somebody's critique of this, which I've read it that Ben Burgis basically agrees with. Is the critique is this is another way of restating what Nate Silver just said.
Right.
So I have a bias in a field in which I am a naif, and I'm going to comment on a book I haven't finished reading yet, but listen to me because I'm Nate Silver.
Yeah.
And I think that is the most, I mean, maybe it's like triggering because of all of our Reddit conversations. That sounds to me like a shitty Reddit response. It's this thing. It's like he just said, honestly, what the potential problems with what he's going to be saying are.
Yeah,
it seems fair to me. Like, people are allowed to have opinions on whatever they have opinions on.
Well, I think this is where we're going in society, but it's taking us a second. Whereas I think we are beginning. The internet is forcing us to appreciate honesty over anything else. And so that's where I think you're coming from, and I think that's where a lot of younger people
that's a good
from.
recognition. Like, none of us knows that we are right about anything. We can strongly suspect or whatever, and also, all of us have incomplete knowledge of almost everything.
Yes, and even experts, can be very wrong in their field. And in fact, I mean, this is, and part of, I think, your feeling is that we've been also coming up in a time, and I feel this way too, where we're seeing where so many examples of where the experts have been wrong,
Right.
Quantitative easing comes to mind.
I don't think they're wrong about that one, though.
You don't think so?
No, they don't think they're wrong about it.
Oh, they don't think. No, they don't. But, I mean, we're beginning to finally feel the effects of it, I think.
Well, they think it's from something else.
Of course, yeah.
Actually, there's somebody, sort of a distant family member who I've talked to about this because he works in finance, and he's like very for quantitative easing, and he's like, it really shows how important it is, and the fact that it held things off for so long is great. And maybe like more of it would just keep holding it off.
I mean, but that's exactly the problem, though. Is it's at what point are you going to make somebody have to? When does the bill come to? Because it does feel like, okay, so as the baby boomers held it off until their death, and now we're having to deal with everything now. It's like they were able to hold it off. They were all in their 50s and 60s when the recession happened, and we were all coming up. And now we're finally the generations are beginning to pass, and the mantles are being, and so okay, so the buck stops with us, I guess. But that's
not even what they think. They think it's just it's actually, to me, it's exactly it is the exact same mentality as Burgis, democratic socialism. It all comes from the same idea that abundance is a right. However, nobody is responsible for producing it.
Yeah, well, I think he would say that people are responsible for producing it, because I do notice whenever he says things are rights, he's always saying they're social rights, meaning that it's with a recognition that these rights don't exist on the individual level, but they exist when you operate in a community. And again, in some cases, I agree with that, because I think that excesses are created when people work together. I mean, that's the whole point of working together, is to be more efficient. We don't have to get into this debate because we've sort of, gone down these roads before.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think efficiency has anything to do with anything, but yes.
You don't think efficiency has to do with working in a group?
I mean, I think it could. I don't think.
Do you know anything about
working
resonance, bro, in the benzene ring?
I don't. I've never even heard of that.
That's the most efficient.
Okay. Cool.
Sharing of electrons.
Sweet.
Anyway, just being silly.
Yeah.
But yeah. Yeah, actually, so it was interesting because there were parts of here where I feel like actually you guys would agree. And like in chapter 6, if we jump to that, where, again, this is what I liked about these two chapters is I think he is being, in a good way, critical of quote, his side, right? I mean, he's coming at Hillary Clinton quite a bit in this as he says, a corporate shill, right?
Right.
And not progressive, very much not progressive. He claims that he was very much a quote, birdie bro, right? And on page 88, he's saying, so this is at the end. And don't get me wrong, I have issues with a lot of this because it's talking about sort of how again, getting on that idea that to bring out a socialist revolution, there's a lot of trial and error. And it's like, okay, well, what does that error look like and how many people are going to die from that error? Because this is at the back of the
quote.
Rosa Luxemburg quote. Because essentially they're saying radically democratic ends must be achieved by radically democratic means. And that's the only way socialism can happen. And so after this quote, it's figuring all of this out means billions of people all around the world who are accustomed to taking orders from bosses and landlords and politicians learning to run their own workplaces and communities. Landlords have to basically learn how to run their own workplace and communities. That's going to be the biggest project of collective self-education in human history. It's going to have to involve multitudes of people engaging each other to discuss and debate different plans of actions, different schemes of social organization, different solutions to 1,000 problems that can't even be predicted from this side of society's democratic reorganization. Yeah. So I'm sure there's things in there that you disagree with, but the first sentence, it's like, I was like, this kind of sounds like Anthony of like,
It's crazy. I 100% oppose it. I read that first sentence, I highlighted it, and it's just like...
Figuring all of this out means billions of people all around the world who are accustomed to taking orders from bosses and landlords and politicians learning to run their own workplaces and communities.
Maybe figuring out the socialist utopia is that, sure. Maybe, so like I agree maybe technically with, in order to form the socialist utopia, they're going to have to figure that problem out. Sure. But I don't want that. I don't think it's a problem worth figuring out.
You have said how you're not against organization, right?
Exactly. I'm not against hierarchy. So this taking orders from bosses or landlords or whatever, the thing is, like, as a landlord, I see not as an abstract evil person, but as a property owner who has chosen to do with who's trying to use their property as something to put on a market and make money from. And then, somebody who is renting from a landlord has made a private contract with that person, a deal. Mm-hmm. Can I live here? I'll pay you this amount, or at the basive level.
Right.
So taking orders from the landlord. First of all, right. I have not ever been in a situation where I find myself taking many orders from landlords.
Well, that's kind of my point, is that it often sounds like, and I get it. Your fundamental thing is about consensual sort of orders. Like, as long as you have consented to the order being given, then you'll follow it. Right.
Right. But that's complicated. I mean, that's a whole complicated thing.
Agree.
But it's the same as a boss. I mean, like, the situation that he's presenting makes no sense to me. It basically means nobody can start a company.
Why?
Or, every company is a co-op in his world. I mean, I've heard him talk about this. It's, so I can't start my trio, my Anthony Calkins trio, and have me be the decider as to how things go. If I bring a second person in, we need to have a consensus. If I want an 8-piece band, we all need to agree on everything, which is absurd.
But you have gone to certain degrees, I feel like. This is where we always go with the fact that if an organization gets large enough, there's going to be things that become non-consensual, unfortunately. And that's where I feel like you guys kind of start...
It doesn't matter how big my band gets, it will never be non-consensual. I will never enslave anybody to be a member of that band.
No,
they may exit at any point.
Yes, of course. But you could be having them do something that they don't realize that they're taking part in. And yes, of course they could have exited the situation, but there's situations where you were not able to exit after a while. And the band, hang on, also the band, I don't like that you keep bringing up the band example, because the band, no offense, is not as complicated of an organization as like running a power plant or something like that, right? There are things, or even just running a hospital or something. There are larger and more complex organizations that I think this is where you really run into this.
But the principle is the same. The principle is the same for every organization.
Not at scale, I think.
What do you mean not at scale?
The larger and more complicated...
So at a certain scale, you have to start enslaving people.
No, at a certain scale. It's not that you're trying to. I think it happens accidentally where people are going to get caught up in doing things.
Who is enslaved at a hospital and how?
Well, good question. I mean, would you say anybody is right now?
I don't know.
Because it sounds like you basically
no, because I don't think anybody is forced to be a doctor. No, I don't think that I don't think the janitors are forced to be there. I don't think the doctors. I don't think the schedulers. I don't think the lawyers. I don't think anybody is forced into these jobs.
And you can leave the country anytime, right? So in that sense, nobody
you cannot
is
leave
enslaved.
The country anytime. That is. You actually cannot leave the country anytime. The government may stop anybody at any point from crossing its borders. There are people who are not allowed to leave the country, and the government reserves the right to do that to any of its citizens.
Right, but here's where, let's say you put in a contract that you've signed with a landlord.
Yes.
You've signed a contract, you haven't read the fine print, and then you try to leave, and they're like, actually, didn't you see this? You can't leave.
Right.
And you're like, well, I didn't realize that that's what I was signing.
Yes, and there are things that are not contractually signable. You cannot sign yourself into slavery. We've read a couple writers who've said, I think Locke and Lane both talked about this to a degree, in that slavery is not actually possible to do. You cannot enslave yourself. And so
because of
a contract that say,
yes.
I'm signing myself into slavery.
And I brought up the microarray example of how your brain's more hackable than you think.
Yes. So I think it may be possible to enslave another person, but it is not possible to enslave yourself. It cannot be your choice. And so as a thing like you are contractually not allowed to leave here is a strange contract, and I think that there potentially legal disputes in either way.
Yes, exactly. That's my point. Is it comes down to contractual differences. Is they could be like, you're not allowed to leave here because you stole this thing, and they're like, I didn't steal this thing. Prove it. And then they say, well, I don't have to prove it because of this line.
Yeah. Okay. But here's the thing. So if somebody says, I need you to be on call from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., and you say, no, I'm leaving, then you have broken the contract. And then the contract is null and void. But they cannot say, no, we're holding you in chains because of this contract. You are allowed to break your agreements, and potentially, depending on that agreement, remuneration will be necessary.
But you're allowed to do that now.
So if I sign something saying I'm going to pay once a month for 12 months, $100 a month, and then after 3 months I say I'm leaving, they can say, well, you still owe me another, $900.
Mm-hmm. And so what recourse do they have if you don't want to pay?
Well, they are owed that. Well, then they sue you? I don't know.
Right, but that's the point, is it gets very complicated when you have somebody that's not...
I mean, the recourse they currently have is they can sue you.
Here's how I feel like your system works. Your system works if everybody is honest and straightforward.
Yeah.
And that's just not reality.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Right, but that's also true in the socialist world.
I agree with that.
This whole thing. I'm not arguing right now for.
I'm not the one saying I want any drastic changes here. I'm sitting here as the moderate.
Yeah,
between you two.
Sure.
That's the point.
Fine. But what I'm saying is I'm not even talking about like Ancapistan. I'm saying that in no situation does it make sense for there not to be, quote, bosses.
Yeah, but I think that I don't know if that's what because of course, I think this is where maybe we should have read a different book where he laid out what he actually wants, because he doesn't really say it explicitly in here, which I don't think was the point of the book. He has
said in interviews that he thinks all companies should be co-ops.
Because he talks about, I mean, this is where I wonder, and this is where I disagree with his standpoint too, that we've talked about, of like, having groups of people, technocrats essentially, and he talks about liberal technocrats versus regular technocrats in this, and the liberal technocrats something different for him. But
I mean, imagine a hospital as a co-op where every decision has to be consensus. That sounds insane.
I agree.
Like there would no longer be any care at all.
Yes, I completely agree. Yeah, there are times where you need a top-down organization, and there are times where you need democratic consensus. Believe it or not.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't reject it outright. I just can't think of any off the top of my head.
Well, I think in a society of conscious beings, having them have an opinion about like who is in charge is not
so maybe
bad.
Marx had it a little bit wrong that democracy is the opiate of the masses.
What did
so
he say
people
was
just
the
need
opiate?
Religion.
Religion, that's right. Okay. I thought it was soma.
Anyway, so maybe it's just people need to feel like they have some say, and then they'll be good little peons.
Well, I mean, it's just, what do you mean by peon? Is it a consensual peon at least? I mean, that's the thing, is like having voluntarily...
what is a consensual peon? What do you mean?
Well, I mean, when you say peon, it's like, okay, it almost feels like you're just degrading anybody that wants to take part in a greater endeavor.
So I'm saying use the modern United States as an example.
Yes.
I would say that our democratic system at its face is a sham. We don't really have much of a democratic system.
Well, it's a republic.
No. I'm saying not even that. Yes, there's that, but way beyond that. I'm saying that I agree, it's crony capitalism, right? No, not even that. It's socialist fascism. I would say that like we have tons of organizations that are clearly the ones running the government, that are unelected. So I'm saying that it's not even pretending to be democracy. Right. It's not, and I'm not talking about the representative thing. I'm talking about actually unelected organizations that are some of the strongest organizations in the world.
Yes, we agree on this. The executive branch is highly bloated.
Right. So what I'm saying is that isn't even pretending to be democracy. And so the idea that our votes have any influence over those massive decisions and how our money is being used and printed and blah, 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 all of these things. However, we do this voting thing every couple of years, and that's what I'm saying. It's a way of assuaging the masses so that they have a sense that they have a say in it when they, in no sense, have any say over that stuff.
Right. And in this sense, I definitely agree. And, it begs a question if there was more direct participation when it was a democracy or whatever, back when it was founded. And I guess I would say yes, probably. Because this is kind of where I'm getting at. I feel like democracy only works with a well-informed public, and well-informed meaning that they're conscious. And I think there has been a concerted effort to degrade the consciousness of individuals in society, because it is better, as you say, to make peons. You say peons, that's where I agree. I think that, when you look at the short-sighted nature of the way most people in our generation think, when you look at the type of music that we indulge in, it's all stupid. Like a lot of it's stupid, right? And I think that is an example of how there has been a concerted effort to diminish the consciousness. But I think that and this is where I'm just starting to try to build back up the argument after we read Hoppe and everything, that I do think probably the system to aspire for is a democracy of some kind. And it sounds like you agree with that in some sense, in that it's at least there's some consent, because democracy at least allows more consent of a governed, right? That's the whole idea. It's the consent of the governed.
I mean, I don't agree, but yeah. I think...
Well, you agree with the consent aspect, that you would want the people being governed over to have a say.
Yeah, but I would never consent to it, sure. I would never in a million years consent to a democratic system where other people can vote about what I can and can't do.
You are consenting to it because you haven't moved to Argentina or whatever, or somewhere else. You haven't... moved to Ancapistan. And that's kind of my point,
there is no Ancapistan to move to.
I know, it was a joke. Yeah. Just because, obviously, it's also an oxymoron, right?
Right.
And I've said this before, whereas I feel like there's probably is worth having a part on the earth for people.
Well, we don't
like
live in a democracy. So I haven't consented to living in a democracy because we don't live in one.
Yes.
And I would not move to one. Let's say that Canada became a perfect democracy. I wouldn't be like, oh, sweet. I'd be like, definitely not going there.
Yeah. Well, this was an interesting question that was posed at one of those property and society things to some of the, like Hoppe and I think Walter Block was there.
Right.
Of where would you go? And first off, I feel like... they also said nowhere's perfect, but they brought up Switzerland a lot and stuff like that.
Switzerland is pretty good.
Yeah, there were some very small countries that I actually didn't even know, hadn't even heard of, in on the east coast of South America. And yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know. It's tough because, I'm trying to figure out where I stand on all this, because I agree with some of the things you've said. I agree with the idea that you want to be consensually governed as much as is possible. I'm not as principled as you, maybe for certain reasons. In that I think that reality is too messy for any one principled system to work
I agree
universally.
With that.
Okay. It feels like you don't sometimes, but that's okay.
Okay. So we've talked about it before. I think I'm rhetorically extreme because for two reasons. One,
you got your back against the wall and everybody's coming at you.
Yeah. No, one is I think that the status quo is so messed up in so many ways that it requires sort of like a splash of water in the face to think about it. Because it's this thing is like bickering about whether or not masks work is not the argument to have. The argument to have is that there is no situation where I think it is reasonable to enforce what anybody else is wearing on their body. At the public level, I think that like a job where you have a dress code is different, but I think that the government en masse enforcing any kind of dress code is not reasonable. And somebody on Reddit made an interesting post. I think they were very mad at me. But they were saying that, if there was a worldwide pandemic and they found that one person had the immunity from it, and that person did not consent to getting experimented on, that they, in 1 second, would take that person's freedom away and just essentially throw them into scientific experiments. And that to me is the thing, is like, I do not believe that you have any right at all to anybody else. Even if that, like, you're responsible for your life. And I understand where they're coming from also. I don't even think that what they're saying is crazy. I think it's wrong. And so to me, it is important to be like that. Like, what they said is a good thing to say, because it shows exactly where they're coming from, and it shows what the disconnect between us is. And so I appreciate that they said something so forthcoming and specific. And that's part of why I do it. The other reason that I do it is that I don't know that it's right in all respects. And by being that straightforward and forthcoming about it, it's easy for people to make arguments against me.
Mm-hmm.
Easy,
yeah.
and like.
No,
I mean,
I agree. Yeah, you're being honest, and also you're allowing people to engage you. I agree. And whereas I think that's one of the reasons my posts don't do as well, because I'm putting this complicated thing, and this is actually something I thought was very good, again, to get back to the book too,
right,
that he was saying of what was an issue with Hillary Clinton versus Bernie Sanders. Right. It's like Bernie was very simple, Medicare for all, or Medicaid.
Yeah, he's operating in much better faith than Hillary Clinton.
And then Hillary Clinton
leaps
was like,
and bounds.
If you want to know what I want, here's a 150-page thing.
And I bet if you read it, you still don't get it.
Yes, yeah. And that was what he was saying, is like, we're smarter than you, let us take care of it. And that's an old way of thinking. It's like, it doesn't work now. It maybe worked in the before the internet came about, but people are, I think, on a whole, more inquisitive now, and which is why they want people to be more honest, especially quote experts, right? Which is why I actually thought that we talked about this, and I guess we'll have to go into it deeply, but like, I thought Hotez should have debated RFK Jr. on Rogan, right? Because I think it doesn't look good when the experts shy from interaction like that. I get why he didn't, and I get why a lot of people don't want to engage, because there's just people who are better rhetorically. I mean, I'm with you on that. I get it, and I don't. I wouldn't really want to have a very long conversation with somebody about music theory that was really just talking out of their ass. I think that these clips have started coming up for me now with Eric Weinstein and who's that guy? Terrence Howard. Yeah.
And I think it's just this weird thing where expertise is not worthless, and that is not what I think. I think that there are far too many dishonest charlatans hiding behind expertise, or hiding behind the moniker of expertise. Yes, and there's a difference between real expertise and just saying something. A degree isn't expertise. A certification isn't expertise. These are stand-ins that have become like common because of like bureaucracy and hiring practices and all sorts of things for their own reasons too. It's not even completely irrational that we have these things, but these things are not expertise. And we've probably all had the experience of a professor who has a PhD, and we're just like, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And we've also had the opposite experience of a professor with a PhD who's an incredibly impressive person. And so it's these things aren't actually stand-ins, and real expertise is actually valuable.
Right, and I agree that it's not a one-size-fit-all. It's interesting. You're coming basically almost opposite of when you were reading the Nate Silver thing, right? It sounds like, but I think I get what you're saying.
I think that it's fine for Terrence Howard to say whatever he wants to say, and I think that if I mean, if Neil deGrasse Tyson doesn't want to listen to him, that's also fine. Like,
Right.
all well and good as far as I'm
Right.
concerned.
Right, and you let the people decide. You put it out there, and you let the people decide.
And I can get it. Here's the thing: I don't even understand what Terrence Howard is saying. So, like, I have no way of evaluating it. It sounds like nonsense to me. So I don't know. And then, like, Eric Weinstein's like, "Oh, you have these like little things and a bunch of like." I don't know. Anyway, so like,
Yeah.
to me, it's not compelling because it doesn't make any sense.
Well, and this is, and I agree. And this is what I was trying to say, where it's not a one-size-fit-all thing, because I think Hotez is an expert, and RFK Jr. has put in a lot of time to think about it as well, which is why I think it would be a useful dialogue for the public.
Right.
I mean, but I get it. Yeah, but I get it, because, I mean, if you're not there's and there was an anthropologist that went on Rogan and debated Graham Hancock and ended up, I think, not coming off as good.
Yeah.
And so there's that risk of you might just be less likable. It might,
but you have to take that risk. I mean, if you're gonna if you're gonna be engaging in an intellectual world, you have to take that risk. I mean, it's like, how can you be a boxer and not do any fights?
Right.
What is this? How are you a boxer? Come on.
Yeah, and honestly, science, and this is something I thought was, getting back to that, I didn't listen to the whole interview because I was with you. I mean, I think I was able to follow some of it just because I have a little bit of math background, but, I mean, not that you don't, but I'm just saying, like, in terms of having at least taken some of the, like, particle physics stuff that
You're talking about the Terrence Howard thing?
Yeah. But they were obviously getting into much more esoteric stuff than I've ever covered, and I haven't ever considered whether 1 × 1 = 2.
But it's just his defense of it is like,
right.
It sounds to me like he's saying that there are deep problems that are entrenched within the mathematical and scientific world filled with dogma and propaganda. And I'm sure that's true.
Right.
But that doesn't mean...
Right.
Like what? Like, so the 1 × 1 doesn't = 2 is like, it's a fun rhetorical thing.
Well, I think he's getting at a very interesting point of how math is a construction of our minds, and there's a disconnect between it and reality. That's what I got. What he was trying to say.
I mean, that's what Trotsky was saying.
Right. Of course. Exactly.
So
It's
that's
back
not
to the
new.
Hume.
That's old, and most people actually accept that because the whole thing about math doesn't exist, or
right.
One doesn't exist. Any mathematician agrees with that.
I don't think anybody does, though.
Everybody in math I've talked to agrees with that because one is an abstraction. It isn't a thing. There is no such thing as one.
I guess what I mean to say, maybe not mathematician, but people who deal with math, which is much more than the population of mathematicians, and in some cases more significant because they're the ones that are doing application. Yeah. I think it brings up a good thing for people to consider. Mm-hmm. That's what I think is a benefit of it.
Right.
I don't even remember what the point I was trying to make off of that was. Yeah, but you're right. It goes to the same Hume issue, right? And yes, exactly. The idea that our minds are, there's a disconnect between our minds and reality.
Right. But to me, it's just like, are we dealing in abstraction or are we dealing in reality? Or is it one apple? And is one apple one time more than one apple? What are you talking about?
Only if you square the apple.
Right. Yeah. What's the square root of 2 apples? Like, this is dumb.
I think isn't that the, I don't know. Yeah, the natural log. I don't know. Well, okay, so that was a good, this is good. This is fiery.
Is it? Well, none of that came out of this book, so.
Well, I think it did because we got on it by talking about that end point. And all I was trying to say is I think that you are, from talking to you, it feels like you're at least trying to get people to consider why they're taking orders from people and whether they're consensually taking orders from people. That's maybe what I was trying to get at with that last section.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. He has his definition of socialism. Socialism is the movement for the working class majority of the population to take charge of society.
Have fun.
Can you hear that?
Yeah, I can.
Wow.
Wait, was that there or was that here?
That was here.
Oh, that's crazy. It sounded to me like it was coming distantly from my parking lot.
Man. Well, and yeah, I mean, he has, I mean, again, and I'm just trying to look for things you agree with. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Delano, sorry, was a canny ruling class politician who understood that he had to throw the working class some concessions to keep popular discontent tampered down to manageable levels during the Great Depression.
Probably.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, he's a fascist from my perspective.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I guess we can get into general thoughts about the book. I think we probably already know, but I agree with whether this is a very useful method of approaching things. I think it begs the question.
Yeah. Yeah, I like when he said the war criminal Colin Powell, because that felt to me like a prime example of his begging the question thing from Taxation is Theft.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was interesting that I guess it makes sense he feels that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with him on it, but I think he's falling into the same thing that he was just complaining about.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Well,
I don't know.
yeah.
Is this system of trying to find fallacies in opposing arguments a good faith way of interacting with people?
Well, I think that
I don't know that it's not.
I was going to say, I think that we're always trying to look for logical inconsistencies.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean? Maybe we don't call it these certain fallacies. I don't think and you were making, I think, this good point last episode, whereas, like, if you come up and you say, like, that's the fallacy of ignorance or whatever, right. Or the appeal to ignorance, yeah, I mean, you're going to probably end up just people are going to come away thinking you're calling them stupid, and that's going to just bring in emotions into the argument, and you'll end up just making more logical discontinuities. So I don't know if going through it as systematically this way,
right?
And this is where we were bringing up the sophist example last time, right? Mm-hmm. Because that was essentially what the sophists were doing for people: is how can you teach somebody to just be rhetorically good so that they can win any argument, regardless of whether there's truth behind it.
Right.
And yeah, so in that sense, I think it's probably not good to label things as such. I think it's probably helpful to at least understand that there are these patterns, but to go about, like in Chapo's Trap House, it was it used to be very popular. I don't know. Maybe people still listen to it. I never really listened to it. We talked about that. I listened to the other one. But, yeah. I think it's at least what I found useful about this book is, at least, first off, getting a completely different perspective from Hoppe. I think is useful. And also, I think that he is he's almost a dying breed on the left. Like I said before, he's like a 90s liberal in many ways. Mm-hmm. And, I think trying to find the things that you agree with people like him is good, because I think there's actually a lot more you would probably agree with him than somebody that's even further to the left or whatever, And that's where I think he ends up probably, this is why, it's not that his podcast is more popular than ours, so I'm not trying to throw shade when I say this, but it's not like he's getting the numbers that more radical people get, which is an example.
So what would you call more radical or more farther left than him?
Well, I think on things when it comes to some of like people that are defending pedophilia as a sexual orientation, that kind of stuff.
I see.
You want me to just come out and say it, don't you?
Well, no, not necessarily. I just mean that I mean, he's looking for, a socialist revolution to reform society is pretty as left as it gets. And
True.
so he seems, he comes off as sort of moderate and reasonable. And I don't even think that leftism is fully unreasonable. So I think that his demeanor is sort of more pleasant, but I think in terms of his actual politics, he's pretty far left.
Yeah, no, it's more of these social issues, which have, I mean, maybe for better or worse, have become just mixed into whatever we call the amorphous left, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, because you're right. Definitely calling for a socialist revolution is radical, although it does sound like what he's saying, even when he says that, he's saying that you need to first educate people about it. Because it does sound like he doesn't necessarily want, bloodshed, and he doesn't want a recreation of the Russian Revolution.
Right.
But I agree. There are moments in here where he like that example that I brought up last time, where he's like, maybe barbarism would be a better alternative than what we have now.
Right.
Whereas I'm like, I completely disagree with that.
Right.
And is one of the reasons why I end up coming off as not a conservative in Hoppe's sense, but like a conservative in the sense of trying to change things at a slower setting.
Like a reactionary. A conservative, you come off as a conservative in Marcuse's sense.
Yes. Where I'm like...
You're regressive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm very regressive.
Yeah.
No, and it's because I understand that... that chaos is going to bring, chaos, disorder and chaos, right? It's like that's what I don't want to happen, and I understand
that's the whole thing about the socialist society needs a dictator,
which he disagrees with. He talks about how that wasn't the good prescription. That was the Lenin, Trotsky prescription, and he's saying actually it needs to be a democratic prescription, which means that you have to get the consent of the governed before you do that. And
but who gets the consent of the governed?
Yeah.
The governed, right? Like,
yeah, easier said than done.
Yeah.
Which is why I think I come away with feeling like a more cellular approach to government is always the best way, whereas. If you can...
Or what do you mean cellular, maybe?
Like the idea that you have communities that have the most sway over what they're doing, and then, slowly it builds up into a hierarchy, but ultimately the buck stops with the smallest sort of, I guess, constituents. And you could, I guess, say, in the sense of Walter Block, or was it Rothbard, everybody's a monarchy or something like that. So in that sense, I kind of agree with that. But at least trying to get things more localized, And in some cases, that's what we've tried to do. But you see the decay of civil society before our eyes, where everybody on the local setting is in their 60s and 70s, the school board and everybody like that. We millennials aren't taking part.
We're all just focused on the federal government.
Exactly. Because that's the thing that's pushed down our throat, too, by media. I mean, and we weren't taught civics in school, which is, again, that was a federally funded...
I was taught civics. I had civics class.
I wasn't really taught it, I'll be honest. Yeah.
Yeah. 8th grade was civics. We had to go through the Constitution.
We went through the Constitution, but, like, in terms of how the local, like, how our... town works, we didn't talk about that at all.
Yeah, we did that.
Oh no, we didn't, not at all.
We did more state and federal was the focus, but we did watch a council meeting.
No, it wasn't even, we did very little state too. I mean, like we had to memorize the Constitution, and we went to Washington D.C. for a trip.
That's
cool. It's where I danced
you had to
with
memorize
my first...
the Constitution?
Yeah. Well, like the amendments, I should say. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Wow. Everyone had to recite it. Yeah. Well, that's cool. So cellular. I mean, kind of like minarchy. You're sort of with Ayn Rand then.
Yeah,
but you probably want forced taxation rather than
well,
like
this
compulsory
is probably
versus
Scandinavian. This is where probably my Scandinavian heritage comes about, because it's like I do feel like, again, and I don't know if you want to get down this debate now, but at a certain level, if enough wealth is being created, it does start to feel strange that, you know, you would have a big gap in how the lowest person's living versus the highest person living. But I don't agree that there should be no difference. You know, it's like, of course, I'm with you on the hierarchy sort of standpoint.
Right.
And this is where somebody like Hoppe would probably come in and be like, well, you're just not thinking about the logical end of all these arguments. But I guess what I would say is that things don't always go to their logical end if you have enough counterbalances. Yeah. Because reality is much messier than the mind. I mean, the mind is messy, but, you know, in the autistic mind, it's not.
Right.
Yeah.
Things don't go to their end is an interesting statement.
Their
that
logical
feels
end.
axiomatically false.
Their logical end.
I hear that. I'm thinking of a line of code, and a line of code will run.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, that is a very synthetic argument, right? Because it's the computer system. First off, there is, you know, if you ran a piece of code enough times, it would probably crash for some probabilistic reason. But you'd have to run it a lot. But there's
something happening that would cause it to crash, right?
Yeah, but it might not be in your model.
Right. I mean, an external factor like the computer timed out or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, or just the fact that you're using electrons to make these circuits, and electrons have a certain amount. I mean, they're probabilistic, but there's a certain amount of uncertainty even to that.
But chaos,
which is the whole
chaos exists. I mean, this is another deep. This is a deep debate in physics.
Right.
Is chaos real? Is randomness real?
Right.
Is everything potentially calculable if you had enough bandwidth, or are there actual forces of randomness?
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that.
Well, this is probably a good transition.
But I think it's the same as the questions I've been getting about the. I posed a question, and I don't even agree fully with the way I posed it on Reddit, but the idea of believing in some kind of a priori, believing in objective truth versus subjective truth, I think it's a similar type of division, if not the actual same division. And I think it's maybe a deeper question about is reality fully
probable, certain, or mappable, predictable?
Yeah. Like, is it fully objective? Is it fully objectively true or something like that? Or consistent, maybe is a better way of putting it. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why the whole free will thing has been so difficult for theologists, because, like, an omnipresent, omnipotent God, to me, you're almost already admitting that free will doesn't exist.
I agree. If God knows the future, if the future is known, then free will is meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I've had this argument with tons of Christians, and it's weird because it doesn't ring true to them, and so there's something in how it's being communicated or something. It's one of those weird things where the argument is just not compelling to them, and that's interesting to me because I have similar things in the opposite direction, and changing my frame of mind. Some ways I get where they're coming from. There's an example of an apple. It was really weird. It was an example of an atheist convention, and the story is some pastor comes up and he's eating an apple, and he's like, "This apple is an apple, and I love it, and it tastes delicious, and it's an apple, and I know there's an apple in my hand, and that is why I believe in God," or something like that. And to me, I was like, when I first heard it, I was like, that's really stupid. That is complete, like it left me cold. It was nothing. But then I said that to a number of theists, and they're like, wow, like snap, snap, snap. They're really into it. And it like really rang true to them. And that's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And this is similar. Like there's something happening in the statement, like there's something in the like God being separated from the system that is meaningful, that changes the rules within the system. So there is free will within the system, even if God is outside the system and knows the whole thing. And to me, that statement by itself is like they can't both exist kind of a thing.
Well, and I think this gets at what I think that the weird thing with consciousness, and I think it's fundamentally because consciousness is kind of a paradox,
right,
is that you run into paradoxes. And that almost feels like a feature and not a bug. And this gets back to Gödel's theorem. And this is kind of what it feels like you're getting at. This is like a paradox of reality when you think about the free will versus the omnipotent, omnipresent God. What you're getting back to your initial question about logical, I guess, determinism of any system, I think that you always are going to run into a paradox, and sometimes that paradox is difficult to understand and predict.
Right.
And this is what Gödel showed. And so I think as soon as you run into it, I think it just is showing you maybe the limit of the brain. Because again, I think that like awareness of oneself and one's surrounding is kind of a paradox. This is why I was like thinking about how the P equals MP problem is kind of related to consciousness too, of like, can you solve a problem in the same amount of time that it takes you to verify the problem? Feels like it gets at the consciousness thing. And I feel like this shows that P doesn't equal MP, which is what most people think. It's a computer problem. I don't know why I'm getting in all this stuff. But the point is, I don't know if you can verify consciousness, but you can know that consciousness exists. That's like the solving of consciousness is realizing it exists.
That sounds like faith, right?
Yeah. But
that sounds like a very complicated way of saying you can have faith.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the Kierkegaard thing. But yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, well, so this is a good transition because I'm going to get us off of politics. Thank God.
Yeah.
We need a break, I think, Antooshka.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Yeah.
Now, I
need a break from Reddit. The last couple kind of hurt my feelings a little bit.
I think that is a good idea. I think that, yeah. I think we could all use a break from Reddit, to be quite honest. So feel free.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was that one person that was, it was silly, but you sent it to me. They were just, Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I read that the PDF, and actually I listened to those lectures too.
Oh.
The Hoppe lectures in Turkey.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Well, I denounce it.
You denounce it?
I denounce white supremacy.
Sure. I mean, I think basically Hoppe does too. That's the thing. Is like Hoppe goes on to talk more about it, and he's like the idea of basing things on racial lines is another form of collectivism that he is ultimately against. However, he actually has an interesting argument of how the state has used various victim group identities to enshrine its own power. And like the anti-discrimination of various groups, ultimately those groups lose their natural anarchic power, i.e. like they're groups of people that have formed, communities that have formed on their own, and the state is actually stripping them of that power and then taking its own power because it becomes the protector.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and to give people background, you got on a few of the Hoppe posts, like, why are you reading Hoppe? He's objectively a white supremacist.
Which, I find to be an absurd question to begin with. But yes.
Yeah, and then you pushed one of them on it. Well, you pushed them all on it, but one of them brought a PDF that quoted some stuff that sounded very much like white supremacist.
Yes.
In that it was saying, like...
I think at its baseline it is white supremacist.
Yeah. And this was in 2018, too, so 18 years after he wrote that book. I just want to say that because it's like, you know, yeah. I mean, certainly in what we read, I didn't get that impression.
Right.
I mean, I can kind of see now that, but, you know... but yeah, he was getting all these things like, look at all the things that, you know, you have in these white male-dominated civilizations that have done all these things.
I think the funny thing is, I mean, the challenging point is that most people, not all, but most people under a different name, if you didn't categorize those as white heterosexual things, would be broadly in support of maintaining all of those things in society, or most of them.
Well, and that's my point, though, is that this is why I denounced that sort of argument, is because I think that, first off, it's easy to see how a lot of these things were, you know, the West was building off the shoulders of giants, whether it was the Arabic, you know, sort using algebra from, you know, Arabic Golden Age and all that stuff. So, I mean, it's not like white male Europeans came up with this stuff de novo.
Right.
And, you know, and then you read 2,000 years ago, Tacitus calling the Northern Europeans barbarians, right? I mean, it's easy to see that we're all sort of have barbaric roots.
I think that Rose Wilder... Oh, sorry. I shouldn't interrupt you. Sorry.
Well, and so what I'm saying is that, if anything, the reason that the West came up was because there was a series of cultural sort of invasions that aided it. You had Genghis Khan and the Huns coming in from the east. You had the Moors coming in from the south, you know, and the Romans and the Ottomans. And everybody was invading the West, and it became a melting pot in a sense. And this is pointed at in why the Persian Empire became so great too, because it was like this crossroads of the East and the West. And I think whenever you have that occur, you have a lot of scientific innovation, and I think that's why the U.S. has been so powerful as well, because we are taking the best of everybody in the world. I mean, it's like I'm always amazed by the people that I'm working with. I talked to like an Indian, and he's like, yeah, I went to an IIT, which is like, you know, the MIT of India, and he's talking to me, you know, and I'm like, I went to U, right. Or I'll have to bleep that, you know, but it's just, yeah. So anyway, I got to say that though, because when I read that, I think I would have been more overt had I known that he had those sort of ideas when we had first read his book.
Right.
Because I want to make it clear that I definitely don't agree with that opinion. And
wait, with what opinion?
And just like the opinion that, the argument that it seemed like he was making about how, you know, the West is great because it was founded on these sort of white male sort of principles, I suppose, and that
I think that there's a distinction in what he's saying that's different than that. But yes,
you know, the good, because I sort of read a bit.
It's not
of it,
because they were white; it's that that was the group of people who at that time in history took on the the ideals of private property and individualism. And no other group was doing that at that time.
Well, yeah, I mean, and maybe I don't.
It was essentially it's very similar to Rose Wilder Lane's theory.
Sure, but I guess it's the identitarianism that I push back against that sort of identitarianism if I see it in the black.
Right. Well, because he goes
population
on
or
to
the
also say
Hispanic.
that he does not believe that white males are intrinsically biologically more
Right.
prone to these things.
Well, and that's I hope that you clip that and send it back to the person, because that was something that we talked about, is that it felt like it was a little out of context. I myself didn't read the full thing because I was like, I don't think
it's going to help though, because the other stuff it's not like they're going to go along with the other stuff he's saying. This is why this is part of why getting into an argument about Hoppe's white supremacy is useless. Because you're not going to convince somebody that, oh, he's a great guy. I think it doesn't even matter whether he's a great guy, because it's the big difference. Hitler's white supremacy, like, you can look at the actions that he took and what happened. And what does the world that Hoppe is proposing look like? It looks nothing like the world that Hitler wanted.
Right. Well, and that's why maybe you keep saying it is white supremacist, that his argument, but it sounds like you're also saying it's not, because of what you're saying, how there's nothing intrinsic about the white people.
So here's my guess. From listening to and reading Hoppe, Hoppe is kind of a racist dude. But I don't think that matters with respect to his theory. And this was another point I was trying to say, and people don't agree with me, and I don't understand it. And maybe
your collectivist point
maybe
was
you
good,
disagree with it. I think that racism from the state level is the worst possible thing. Like, that is Hitler. That is institutional race-based policy.
Yes.
And the crazy thing is, it's not just Hitler. Like, affirmative action is institutional race-based policy. That is systemic institutional racism by definition. And I know that there's those who like it, and like you read Kendi, and Kendi wouldn't call it that, but from my perspective, loves institutional racism. Will argue all day for it. Loves it. And I think that is what you don't want. I think that at an individual level, if your uncle is racist, like, that aspect of your uncle is unsavory, but if he has a tip for how to cook steak, that doesn't mean that he's wrong about that. And this is the thing, is individual racism amongst people is between people to figure out. As long as it isn't enshrined in the institution that has coercive force on its side.
So I thought your point about collectivism was a good one, and it actually got that person that was pushing you on this to post in a subreddit we talked about, asking conservatives essentially.
Oh yeah. I didn't see the connection between the posts, actually.
Well, you were all saying how you're not a collectivist by definition, and so that's why I thought that was a good point of how it's like you're not looking at it from the racial terms at all, because they were calling you a Nazi and stuff like that, and you were like, actually, I hate Nazis and I don't like race and I hate racists, and I'm actually by definition a non-collectivist, because I think that looking at things along those lines is not helpful.
Right.
And that's kind of what I'm saying also. And then they basically posted in a Republican, or like it was like a conservative subreddit, I don't remember which one it was, after having that conversation with you. By the way, I liked how you were like, after that you were still like, by the way, I'd really like to know what your opinion is, though. I thought that was a very nice gesture.
No, it wasn't, because I said that before. It was like I feel like we're mixing up posts here too.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Oh, you were being snarky?
No, I wasn't.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
I'm saying that he said that he thought that individual racism was more important than structural racism, which I thought was a wild claim. And so that's when I said, I'm interested to know why.
I see. But
then he ignored that and commented on something else.
Yes. Well, and they were asking,
and then he was like,
basically,
well, the reason, he said something like, the reason that I think that is because of white supremacy in me, or something like that. And that, to me, is utter nonsense. The idea that thinking that structural racism is more important than individual racism is white supremacy is goofy.
No, and I mean, that's honestly one thing that is a very progressive and liberal sort of thing that's being taught in a lot of these schools about structural racism. I feel like we don't talk about individual racism that much anymore.
I mean, I think it all gets mixed up, though, is the problem. It's like,
well, and
we're
that's
not
what I was
clear
going to
on
say.
any of this stuff.
I don't think that calling it wild is actually appropriate, or not appropriate. I mean, it's appropriate, but I don't think it's wild to come from a position that individual racism is the root of it all, because the individual is the root of everything. So, but
no,
yeah,
but not the root of it all is a more important thing to battle than structural racism. It feels wild to me, but maybe not.
Well, you're kind of saying that, though, in that when you talk about how it needs to be dealt with on the individual level outside
when I
of the
say dealt
structural
with,
aspect.
I don't mean like eradicated.
Well,
I mean, I'm not talking about some like
I'm not
cabal to like stamp this out.
But in terms of confronting things that are racist, you are very much sounding like, get rid of the structural component so that you can then better communicate on the individual basis.
I see. Well, I don't think one has to do with the other. I think get rid of the structural component because that's like a dystopian form of tyranny.
Antooshka's trying to get us canceled. No, I know. This is why I like you, because you're honest and more honest than most people.
I'm not like pro people being racist. By the way.
I know that, but it's just the way you say things sometimes. It can come off that way.
Right.
All I'm trying to say is then they posted in this other subreddit.
I see. Yeah.
About collectivism, asking, is it ever bad to be a collectivist? And I just thought that was interesting. So you did get to them thinking about a greater point. I think they were related. I mean, they posted it like 10 minutes after your guys' conversation.
Right. Was there any good responses to it?
I mean, I only skimmed it. I mean, I personally, I try to stay off Reddit.
Is it ever bad to be collectivist? That's to me, that's also funny because, like, is it ever bad to be anything? Probably.
Yes.
My answer to almost anything is yes.
Right. Which is where we get back to how, anything taken to its logical end can probably be bad, any political system at least, maybe not anything. And which is why, almost by definition, you never want to take a system to its logical end in the political sense.
Right.
Because that's radicalization on any
right.
Anyway, I think it's probably good we talked about that, but I don't know if I was wanting to talk about it. But I think it's good that we.
I mean, if you want to cut it out, go for it.
No, I won't. I'll leave it in. I mean, but that was, it was. Yeah, like I said, I think had I known that he had expressed things in that way, I would have probably, quite frankly, just.
I mean, here's the thing: we read Nietzsche explicitly talking about how bad Jews are. Like, in his words.
It's true.
And I understand that you have an argument about how that isn't really what he means. But that's what I'm saying is I have a similar argument about Hoppe, that Hoppe has a broader point, and it doesn't actually matter the race that he's talking about. And in a similar way that Nietzsche it doesn't matter that he's using the word Jews. It's a placeholder for a larger idea. But that doesn't mean he didn't say
Protestants in there too. But yes, he said it started with the Jews, the slave revolt. But I don't know. I mean,
he also suggested that anybody who is using intellect over their force art is engaging in like Jewness. And he talks about 3 Jews and a Jewess taking over Rome. Like the language is damning. How about that?
Yeah. No, I think that's a good analogy, that he's getting at a greater point, and also that even all these contradictions abound within Nietzsche, because there's at times where he's saying it sounds like he's saying that's bad and that you should go back to the Roman.
But then also he said that we owe this the entire society is structured in this Jewish way. So
right. And also that the Roman way isn't really that great, and that actually the great way is just empowering the individual is kind of what it ends up sounding like, which you could say,
which is actually what Hoppe's saying,
right? And which is what I think a lot of us are saying. I think that's even in some ways what Ben Burgis is saying.
In some
believe
ways,
it or
I
not,
agree.
Yeah.
Which is where my point about it doesn't matter. And like when they say, "Are you concerned that he's a white supremacist?" My answer is no, I am not.
Yes. Well, yeah. I think that,
and I think I think that there's a rhetoric. It's tricky, and this is where I didn't know how. I don't always know how to respond, and so sometimes I'm trying to respond sort of in a blanket, truthful way. Sometimes I'm trying to be probing, because the thing is, what you don't want to do, I think, is you don't want to end up in a conversation where you're bickering about whether or not Nietzsche was anti-Semitic. That's not going to be a useful conversation.
Well, I think that you're right in that it is good to try to understand what these people are coming from, where like what the broader point is. But there are times when it is overtly racist, or people are calling for the death of people based off of a collective identity, where it does matter what they think, right?
Right.
That's where I would disagree with what you were saying. How it's like,
well, I think that
if Hoppe was coming out and saying like we should be rounding people up of certain ethnicities and races, which I don't think he's saying. But that would be a big issue.
Uh-huh. Well, I think that,
and I think it would matter is the point in how you are looking at what they're writing. And I do actually think that even those opinions matter with reading his general sort of doctrine, because it does again make you think like he's trying to set up a system where you have principles and then you follow them to just their logical end.
Right.
But I think that, as I've already said, there's times not to do that.
Yes.
Especially if it results in discriminatory tactics that are again
because then
people.
You have some higher order principle that you're trying to follow.
Exactly. Yes. Which is where paradoxes abound in any time you try to follow a logical system.
Yeah. I think that there's a question. Like somebody says, "Why are you listening to him?" I have an answer to that. If somebody says, "Do you care that he is?" I mean, there's a begging the question. He is baked in, and now in order to have a conversation with them, we have to shift the entire framework, and that's where it starts to become a problem. And this is what I texted you is none of these people are engaging with anything I've said or anything he's said. They have shifted it to not engage with it, to dismiss it outright because of a label. And that's where it's like, I don't want to have an argument about the label. Right.
Which, thank you for bringing that up, because I wanted to agree with that, is that is a good point. Because he has, whether people like it or not, has laid out many of the best arguments for libertarianism. Right. Or at least the most coherent arguments.
Right, exactly.
And so you almost have to engage with his I guess conceptualization on some level if you want to have these discussions, because at least in my opinion, because you have to understand, even if you're a socialist, you need to understand where the best argument's coming from on the libertarian side. Mm-hmm. And I think what people will find if they probe that is a lot of them come from Hoppe. Right. Because, I mean, and even Rothbard said that, right? He was his greatest student and all that stuff. Yep. And Rothbard is known for having sort of codified libertarianism, right? Mm-hmm. So yes, I don't regret reading it, but I
mean, I think it's one of the best fairly recent political treatises out there. It's so so challenging.
It's very challenging. Yes. And we already said and this is actually something like Patrice O'Neill would often say, is like, I want you to be honest, even if it's like I'm not going to like it, because then I'll at least know where you're coming from.
Exactly.
It's like he'd rather talk to a white dude who's like being overtly racist.
Yes.
I mean, he said that many times on the Opie and Anthony show. Because at least then you can start to engage and maybe get at a deeper thing of how actually there's more in common between you guys and stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know, though, man. It's tricky.
We shouldn't be hiding ideas because they're scary.
Well, yeah. No, I mean, I agree on a theoretical level, but it becomes tricky, and this is where I would agree that society has placed certain vices over us where we can't even start to broach these conversations because because quite frankly, I have more to lose than you do. Not really, but you know what I mean. It's like you have structured your life in a more anarchic way, which makes sense, right? Whereas I'm embedded in more systems. So I can't be as forthright about anything. And, I think
that is a significant... that's a significant thing to think about for anybody, like that. That the systems that we have in place, and maybe this is true of any systems anywhere. Maybe this isn't even unique to our systems. However, I would say that we are living in a strange time where
I don't know if it's strange. It's pretty common. I mean, there's always this is why. Galileo was remembered. Like exactly. There's systems that constrict everybody over time.
Yeah, it's true. Systems cut against honesty.
Yes, but it's not to say that they should be burned. Anyway.
The middle way. A little bit of dishonesty and a little bit of honesty.
That's what I'm here for. And people, I mean, you talk about people hating you, but I think anybody from Reddit listening probably appreciates the fact that you are just more forthright about everything. Whereas, it's like I'm always going to be at least tiptoeing a little bit on these things.
Right.
And part of it is because also I obviously I don't agree with you on everything that we've been talking about.
Right.
But, I mean, this is the great question that I think our generation's really going to be grasping with that we already talked about is the limits of honesty. Because right now, we felt so constricted and the internet has allowed so much more honest dialogue that I think we're sort of, as people like to talk about, the pendulum swinging completely to like open honesty about everything. And I think we're going to see where that leads. And I think with everything, it's going to come back to you want a little bit of honesty, but also probably complete honesty isn't good because people are stupid. Like we all have half-baked ideas. So in some ways, it's good to hold your tongue if you feel like your idea is not fully...
I'm not a radical honesty proponent. If we're having a conversation about our ideas, it is... from my perspective, only ethical and respectful to be forthcoming about what my ideas are. Not about every little thing. Like, I don't need to tell you about my ideas about baking a cake unless we're talking about baking a cake.
And what did you do last night?
Yeah, right.
Where did you sleep last night?
Yeah, you're right. In the pines.
In the pines.
Yeah. I don't know. But I also don't think... We read Mussolini. Like, I am not a proponent of Mussolini at all.
No.
But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't engage with the ideas. That's the thing, is why would you read a white supremacist? Why would you read anybody? Like, Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. I consider him extraordinarily racist. But that doesn't mean that I'm not interested in engaging with what he has to say.
Right.
I'm not a socialist either, and I read this Ben Burgis thing, and it's interesting. I read Marcuse. Like, there's tons of reasons to engage with material you both agree and don't agree with.
And I completely agree with that, which is why I've been going along with you on all this stuff. Even though sometimes it's kicking and screaming. No, yeah. Which is why also that I'm taking the reins for a bit. And going to get us to talk about what I fundamentally like to talk about, because I think it's at the base of everything, which is consciousness.
Nice.
So if you've been listening to these last 9 episodes on political theory, or even 12, I feel like we've been doing political theory for a while. Yeah, we need a break.
We need to get rid of all of our listeners.
We need to get rid of every one of you. every and literally one of
everyone
you.
Who's like, oh, it's so cool. They talk about crazy politics stuff. Bye.
No. Where you blame me, I'm getting us to talk about consciousness. But ultimately, one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I feel like actually this is where you need to understand consciousness in order to understand what are the best political systems. Because I think based off of the relative level of consciousness of a population is going to determine what the type of government is going to work.
Right.
And like I said, I think in order for a democracy to work, you need conscious individuals. Or maybe highly conscious individuals. Whereas, a monarchy probably works if you have a bunch of people who are at a lower level, like you've diminished their consciousness through alcohol and stuff like that.
Right.
So we're doing
what is it?
Roger Penrose. I sent it in the chat.
Okay.
To Shadows of the Mind. So this is a book about consciousness and a theory of consciousness, of how it could be conceived as a quantum problem.
Okay.
So
is there a particular edition you're using?
I think just the first one. Let me see.
Shadows of the Mind is Searching for the Missing Consciousness. First edition, 1994.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool. What? Yeah, so, and then Brother X is going to be joining us for 3 episodes. So
it'll be exciting.
Yeah. You think I'm a democratic socialist. Wait till you hear that guy.
I don't think you're a democratic socialist. You're a moderate.
I'm a weirdo. I'm just no fun.
Yeah.
I'm the person everybody hates.
Including Ben Burgis.
Including Ben Burgis. That's okay, though.
That's okay.
And Hoppe, I'm sure, would...
He's welcome to come on and argue with us. That'd be fun.
Ben Burgis?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I called him a goofball in all love.